Hello there, welcome to another Unity tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to further extend the Floor is Lava game that I've been building over the last few videos. So to begin with, we'll create a very simple main menu that the player can use to start the game or quit to the desktop. We'll also give the player the ability to pause the game and open a pause menu. And then we'll modify the GameManager slightly so that it can track the next scene that needs to be loaded, as well as the build index for the first level. Okay, so I've created a brand new scene here. The first thing I'm going to do is go to the hierarchy window, right click, go to UI, and create a canvas. We'll change the canvas scaler, the UI scale mode, to scale with screen size, and the reference resolution will pass 1920 for the X and 1080 for the Y. Then we'll come over and change the match value to 0.5 so that our canvas scales with the screen width and screen height. Next, I'll come back over to the canvas in the hierarchy window and right click on it, go down to UI, and I'm going to select Legacy and then Button. We'll rename this button button_play. Okay, so I'm just going to change my scene to 2D mode by clicking on this button up here in the scene window. I'll double click on the button in my hierarchy. Okay, so here we're going to change our button size. So I'm going to come over to the transform for the button, and the width will change to 800 pixels wide. Let's zoom out so we can see our whole button here. And the height I'm going to change to 90 pixels high. Now for now, we'll leave all the colors and the action for the button component, but we'll expand the button in the hierarchy and select the text. I'm going to turn best fit on, and the text I'm actually going to change to say play. Okay, so we have one button now. We need a second button, so I'm going to select the button play in the hierarchy and press Ctrl D to duplicate it. We'll rename our new button as button quit. I'm going to expand our button quit, select the text, and just change the text to say quit. Okay, so our quit button is currently sitting on top of our play button. So we want to position these so that, they're separate. So I'm going to select the Y position for our quit button. And I'm going to set that to minus 150 pixels. And I'm just going to keep it sort of even spacing. So for the play button, I'm going to set that to be 150 pixels on the Y position. Okay, so we've created our buttons now, but if we were to click on these in the game, they wouldn't do anything, and that's because there's no methods attached to the button component. So what we need to do now is write a script, a small little script for our main menu that our buttons can utilize to call some functionality when they're clicked upon. So I'm going to select my canvas in the hierarchy, go to add component, and I'm going to start typing the name of the script I want to create, which is going to be called MainMenu. Yes, so we'll call it MainMenu. And I'm going to click create and add. And as you can see, that's added the MainMenu script to our canvas, and it's also added the script in our project window. So let's open it in Visual Studio by double clicking it in the project window. Okay, so like I said, this is going to be a fairly simple script. Now, we're not going to use the start or the update methods, but we are going to use the awake method, which I'll inherit, and just change the comment or the summary here, and we'll say awake is called for start. Okay, now in the awake method, what we want to do is we want to make sure that our cursor is visible and can be moved around the screen. If the mouse cursor is not visible or can't be moved, then the player won't be able to navigate the menu. So to make sure our cursor is visible, we'll say cursor.visible is equal to true. Then to make sure that our mouse cursor can be moved around the screen, we'll say cursor.lockState is equal to cursor lock mode, and I'm going to say .confined. which means that it can be moved around the screen, but will be restricted to the game window. You could set the cursor lock mode to none if you wanted the player to be able to move the mouse cursor around freely, say between like 2 monitors. Okay, so that's all we need to do for the awake method. And now we're going to create the 2 methods that our buttons will use. So the first button needs to load the first level scene. So we'll create a public method with a void return type and call it start game. Now in here we need to use the scene manager. So we'll go to the top of our script and we'll add a new namespace and we'll say using Unity engine.scene management, which will allow us to use the scene manager. So now we can come back down to our method and say scene manager.load scene. And the parameter I'm going to pass to our load scene method here will be 1, because that is going to be the build index of the first level of the game. So we'll just add a quick little summary here and we'll say loads the first level of the game. Cool. So next we'll write the other method that we're going to need for our main menu for the second button, which needs to quit to the desktop. So in order for our button to use it, it will need to be public and we'll have a void return type and we'll call this method quit to desktop. And in this method, all we need to say is application.quit. So when that's called, it's going to quit the game and close it down completely. Okay, so we'll add a summary for that one and we'll say quits the game to the desktop. Excellent. So now we can save our script and let's go back into Unity and finish setting up our buttons. Okay, so I'm back in Unity. So when we're setting up our buttons, we need to remember that our main menu script is attached to our canvas object because this script contains the methods that the buttons are going to use. So we'll click on our play button first and scroll down to the button component. And in this section where it says on click, where there's this little plus sign, I'm going to click on that. And this little slot here, we want to drag in our canvas object because that's the one with the script attached to it. Then we can click on this drop down menu here. And right at the bottom, we can see our script called MainMenu. And here are all of its public methods. So this is our play button where we want to call the start game method. So I'm going to select that. Next, we'll select our quit button and I'm going to do the same thing. So on the button component, I'm going to add a new on click event. We'll drag in our canvas into the object slot there. Open up the function drop down menu, go to main menu. And for this one, I'm going to select quit to desktop. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is save this scene and add it to the build index in the appropriate spot. So I'm just going to press Ctrl S to save the scene. And we'll save this scene inside our scenes folder. Now my sample scene here is the one that has our level in it. This is going to be our first level for now. So we'll give this scene the name main menu scene, and then I'm going to save that. So now in our scenes folder, in our project window, you can see we have 2 scenes. If I double click on the sample scene, it opens up our level scene. And if I double click on main menu scene, it opens up our main menu scene. Excellent. So we just need to add our main menu scene to the build settings. So I'm going to go up to the file menu at the top of Unity, select build settings, and we can see our sample scene is already there and it has a build index of 0. But when we wrote our start game method, it's going to try and load the scene that has a build index of 1. So we want to add our main menu scene above the sample scene. So I'm going to drag the main menu scene from the project window into the scenes in the build part of the build settings. And then I'm just going to drag sample scenes below it. So you can see our main menu scene now has a build index of 0. and our first level has a build index of 1. So just as a little conventional practice that I like to endorse, I always have my main menu set to be the scene with a build index of 0. Cool, so with that done, let's hit play and try it out. Okay, so first we'll click on the quit button, and you'll notice nothing happens from inside the Unity editor. Now, of course, we don't want our game to shut down Unity because we're working on it. But if we were to build the game into its executable format and then attempt to use this button, it would shut down the executable and return to the desktop. So let's try our play button now. Cool. So you can see as soon as we click on that play button, it loads our first level. Excellent. Okay, so now we have a functional main menu. So I'm going to open my sample scene, but before I do, I want to rename it because, like I said, this is going to be our first level. So let's just rename this to level 1. Then I'll double click on it to open it. Okay, so next we'll implement the pause menu and the ability for the player to pause the game. So I'll come over to my canvas HUD in the hierarchy and right click on it. Go down to UI and select panel, and I'm going to name this object pause menu. And right now we can see, if I double click on it, we can see it's stretched to fill the size of the entire HUD, the entire canvas, which is not what we want. So we'll come over to the anchor, and this is where it's set to stretch. So I'll click on this, and I'm going to hold shift to set the pivot point as well as the origin, and then Alt to set the position. And I'm going to click on the center anchor point here. Now, nothing's changed visually, but we can actually change the width and the height here now. It's actually set to the size of the canvas. So if we reduce this, it will reduce the size of our pause menu. So I'm going to put 780 for the width, and for the height, we'll put 360. Now, this panel is a bit too transparent for my liking, so I'll come over to the image component for our pause menu, click on the color, and I'm going to come down to the alpha channel value here, and I'm just going to plug in 230. Right, so it's mostly solid. Alright, so I want the player to have two options on the pause menu. I want a button that will allow the player to resume the game, so it will disable the pause menu again and re-enable the game time. And I also want a button that will allow the player to return to the main menu. So I'm going to right click on my pause menu in the hierarchy, go down to UI, and just like for our main menu, I'm going to go to Legacy and then select Button. Now we'll rename this button as Button Resume. Okay, so I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more. Now I'll come over to the transform and change the width. So we'll say 640 pixels for the width, and we'll say 90 pixels for the height. I'm going to expand the button in the hierarchy and select the text. Now I want this text to say resume. I'm also going to set the font size to 18 and turn best fit on. And I'll make sure the minimum size is 18, and I might even up the max size to 44. All right, so we have one button. So I'm going to select my resume button in the hierarchy and press Control D to duplicate it. And we'll rename this button to Button Main Menu. And then I'm going to expand it in the hierarchy, select the text, and I'm just going to change the text to say main menu. Okay, so now our buttons are overlapping each other, so we need to reposition them. So I want the resume button to be anchored to the top and maintain its position relative to the top of our pause menu, and the main menu button to maintain its position relative to the bottom of the pause menu. So for my main menu button, I'm going to come over to the anchor point on the transform, hold Shift and Alt, select the bottom one. Now I don't want it to hug the bottom of the pause menu, so I'm going to give it a Y position of 50, so it maintains 50 pixels from the bottom of the pause menu. And now I'll select my resume button. Again, click on the anchor, on the transform, hold Shift and Alt, and I'm going to select the top for this one, and I'll buffer this one from the top of the pause menu by -50 pixels. Okay, so we could create a new script for the pause menu, but I think considering we have this script for our game HUD, it makes sense to include the pause menu functionality within that, considering the pause menu is a piece of the game HUD. So we'll open the game HUD script from the project window. Okay, so here is the game HUD script that we created in the last video. And the first thing I want to do is add a new serialized variable. So we'll start with adding a serialized field attribute. And then we're going to say private game object, and we'll call this pause menu. We'll give this a tooltip attribute, and we'll say a reference to the pause menu game object in the UI for the scene. Okay, now we'll just make a note of this property here, cursor enabled. I actually included this in the last video and we didn't end up using it, we didn't end up implementing it. But we are going to use this auto property here. So if you haven't got this auto property, you need this. And what it's used for is to toggle the mouse cursor and lock state on and off. Okay, so we'll go down to the start method. And what we want to do here is we're just going to add a comment for now. And we're just going to say toggle pause menu off if it is on. Now to do this, we're going to need to create a new method. So underneath the start method, we're going to create a new public method, which will have a return type of Boolean. And we're going to call this method toggle pause menu. And it's not going to take any parameters. So the first thing we need to do in this method is set the active state of the pause menu to the inverse of what it currently is. So if the menu is off, we'll turn it on, and if it's on, we'll turn it off. So first we'll reference our pause menu variable, and then we'll say .setActive and call the setActive method. And we need to pass one parameter in here, which we want to be the active state, the current active state of the pause menu object. So we'll say pause menu .active self. Now to pass the inverse of this property, because if the game object is on, this will return true, which means, if it's already on, it won't do anything. So to pass the inverse in front of that, we'll put an exclamation mark, and then we'll finish the line with a semicolon. So that will turn the pause menu on if it's currently off, or off if it's currently on. So the next thing we need to do is toggle the state of the mouse cursor depending on whether the pause menu was turned on or off. So if the pause menu was turned on, if its active state is equal to true, we want to set the cursor enabled also equal to true. And if it was false, then we want to set cursor enabled also equal to false. So underneath that, we'll simply say cursor enabled is equal to pause menu .active self. Now our method needs to return a Boolean value. So we'll have it return the state of the pause menu so we can tell whether it was turned on or off. To do that, on the next line, we'll say return and then pause menu .active self. So with that method finished, we'll write a quick method summary for it, and we'll say toggles the pause menu and the cursor state. Okay, so the next thing we'll do is, hang on, I just saw a spelling error. Change the name to say toggle pause menu, and now we'll change our start method comment, and we'll check our pause menu active state. So we'll say if pause menu .active self is equal to true, and inside that if statement we'll call our toggle pause menu method. Excellent. So let's save that script with Control S and let's test it out. So let's go back into Unity. Okay, so I'm back in Unity, and before we test the functionality out, we need to set our scene up. So I'm going to select the canvas HUD object in the hierarchy, and we have this pause menu variable here. So I'm going to drag the pause menu object into that variable slot. And just as a note, the buttons aren't going to work yet. We haven't created any button methods that we need or hooked any functionality up to them. But what should happen is when we hit play, this panel here should turn off because it's currently active. So let's try it out. Excellent. So you can see as soon as the game started, the pause menu was disabled. Cool. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is give the player the ability to toggle the pause menu by pressing the escape key on the keyboard. And we'll also set it up so that when the pause menu is toggled on, the game time stops. And then when the pause menu is disabled, the game time will resume. Now, all of this functionality I'm going to write in the GameManager script that we've been creating over the last couple of videos. So we'll open that up. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is create a couple of variables, and they're going to be hidden private variables. So our first one will be a private mouse look, and we'll call it mouse look. And that's going to be a reference to the mouse look script attached to the main camera. And the second variable we're going to need will be a private boolean, and we'll call it game paused and give it a default value of false. Okay, so we'll come down to our awake method here, and we'll find a reference for our mouse look variable. So we'll say mouse look is equal to find object of type mouse look with a couple of parentheses before closing the line. And then in the start method, and I know we gave it a default value of false, but just to make sure, we'll say game paused is equal to false. All right, so next let's go down to the update method. And inside this if statement here, that's checking if level timer is greater than 0. So if our level timer is counting, we're going to do a couple of things. First, we're going to create a new if statement, and we're going to check to see if input dot get button down is equal to true, and the input we're checking for here is going to be cancel. Then we'll open a set of coding brackets, and for now we'll just put a comment and we'll say toggle the pause game menu. And the second thing we want to do here is all of this functionality here that is actually decreasing our timer and checking if it's less than or equal to 0, then calling game over, as well as updating the timer on the HUD. All of that I want to encapsulate in a new if statement. So we'll open a new if statement here, and the condition we're going to check is we're going to make sure that game paused is equal to false. So we're only going to decrease the timer and update the HUD if the game paused variable is equal to false. So then I'm going to open a set of coding brackets here, and Visual Studios will actually kind of automatically format everything. And I'm going to remove the last one, go to the line beneath the last line that I want to be included in the if statement, and then I'm going to just insert the closing bracket there again, and it's automatically formatted everything nicely within that if statement. Okay, so next we're going to create a method responsible for pausing the game. So right at the bottom of my GameManager class, underneath all the other public methods, I am going to start by creating a public void, and we'll call this toggle pause game with an empty set of parentheses because it's not going to take any parameters. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do in here is we're going to say game paused is equal to, and here we're going to determine whether or not the game's paused based on whether the pause menu gets turned off or turned on. So we'll call that functionality through our HUD. So we'll say HUD.toggle pause menu, and that returns a Boolean value, which is getting stored in game paused. So next we want to toggle the ability for the player to move and look around depending on whether or not the pause menu is active or not. So if game paused is equal to true, we know that the pause menu is active, and if it's equal to false, we know that it's not active. So on the next line, we'll say player.canMove, and we want to set this equal to the inverse of game paused. So I'm going to start with an exclamation mark and put game paused, just like we did before, which will give the inverse value of the game paused variable. Underneath that, we'll do the same thing for our mouse look. So we'll say mouseLook.look enabled is equal to exclamation mark game paused. So that's going to disable or enable the ability for our player to look around and move depending on the state of the game menu. The last thing we want to do is actually stop the overall time for the game, and not just the timer, but all of the time that affects physics and stuff moving and that kind of thing. And that's actually relatively easy. So here we're going to say if game paused is equal to true, right? So if the game has just been paused, we're going to say time.timescale is equal to 0. And that's going to completely slow down the overall time scale for anything that uses delta time, basically. Now, if game paused is equal to false, so we'll open an else statement to counter the if statement, we want to set our time.timescale value to 1, which will turn time back on, turn it back to normal. Right, so now that we've done that, let's scroll back up to our update method and replace the comment we wrote here, and let's actually call the toggle pause game method. Okay, so we should actually be able to test that, so let's save the script, Control S, and let's go back into Unity and set everything up. Okay, I'm back in Unity, and we actually just set up our Canvas HUD script before, which is what the Game Manager is going to reference. And for now, all that we can do is set up our resume button functionality. So I'm going to select that in the hierarchy, scroll down to the button component in the inspector and add a new on-click event. Now the Game Manager is the object that we want this button or this event to reference, and the function we want is in our Game Manager script, and right at the bottom of all these methods we have the toggle pause game method. So I'm going to select that, and now let's hit play and test it out. Okay, so I'm in play mode now. If I click on the game window, my cursor will actually disappear. We can see the timer is counting down, and if I hit escape, all right, good, the pause menu gets brought up. We can see the timer stops, and if I click on resume, the pause menu goes away and the timer resumes again. Now say for example I jump and pause in the middle of the air, you'll notice everything stops, and if I hit resume again, everything starts working just as expected. Okay, so the next thing we need to implement is a method that will be called when the player clicks on the main menu button in the pause menu. And we're also going to implement the functionality required to increase the current level when the player hits the end of the game trigger. And if the game detects that there are no more scenes or levels in the build settings, then it's going to go back to the main menu. So we'll go back to our Game Manager script for this. Okay, so starting off, we're going to create a couple of new variables. Now, these variables are going to be special. So the first one is going to be a constant integer. So it's going to be a private const of the type int, and we'll call it first level index, and we'll set it to 1, right? Now, what a constant value is, it's a value that does not change after the code has been compiled. So as the game's running, this value can never change. It's already set before the game even runs. So I've set that to 1, so I'm just going to make sure that my first level in the build settings is always set to have a build index of 1. So if for whatever reason your first level is not at a build index of 1 in your game build settings, you would set this value here to correspond with the build index of your first actual game level. Okay, and underneath that, we're going to have another hidden private variable, and this one is going to be a static integer, and we'll call this next scene index, and we'll also give that a default value of 1. So what a static variable is it's a variable that's shared between all instances of the class that it's contained within. This means we can access this variable through the class type rather than having to reference a specific instance of the class and access it through that instance. It also means that this default value here will only be used when the game first launches. So we need to make sure that we set that appropriately when we transition between scenes. Okay, so next we're going to scroll down to the update method. And we want to work within the else statement that's countering the if statement checking if level timer is greater than 0. So if this else statement here is running, we know that level timer is either equal to or less than 0. So it's not counting. And at the moment, we have it set up so that if any sort of input is detected, we are loading a scene and it's just getting the currently active scene and reloading that one. So let's remove this line and we're going to replace it with some different functionality. Okay, so first of all, we're going to open an if statement and here we're going to check to see if our next scene index has a value of 0. And if it does have a value of 0, we want to load the main menu. And we'll just write that as a comment for now because we're going to create a method for that. But we will counter that if statement with an else statement. And here we're going to say scene manager dot load scene, and we'll pass it the next scene index variable. Okay, so next underneath our game over method, I'm going to create a brand new public method with a void return type, and we'll call it load main menu. It's not going to have any parameters. Now here, we're going to make sure that we set our timescale back to 1, because this method is also going to be the method that can be called from the pause menu. So if it's being called from the pause menu, then the timescale will be set to 0. And if we're going to load a scene, we need to set the timescale back to 1. Now the other thing we need to do here is reset the value of our static variable. So we'll say next scene index is equal to first level index. Now this is important because we want the player to have to start from the very first level again if they are going back to the main menu through the pause menu. And because next scene index is a static variable, it won't automatically be reset when the player loads the initial level from the main menu. Then after that, we'll say scene manager dot load scene, and here we'll pass it a value of 0, following the convention I mentioned earlier, where the main menu scene will always have a build index of 0, so we can just manually pass that parameter to the load scene method. Okay, so while we're here, we'll also modify our level complete method. So what we want to do here, if the level complete method gets called, we want to increment our next scene index value as long as that value is within the amount of scenes included in the build settings. So we'll open an if statement and we'll say if next scene index is less than scene manager dot scene count in build settings, and that's going to return the number of scenes included in the build settings. But we need to remember that we're comparing an index against a length. So we want to take 1 off that length to keep the index within the bounds of the available range. So if this if statement executes, all we want to do is say next scene index plus plus, which is going to add 1 on to the current value of the next scene index variable. Now, if that value is outside of that range, we'll use an else statement here and we'll say next scene index is equal to 0 to set it back to the index for the main menu. So then lastly, we'll scroll back up to our update method and we'll replace this comment that we wrote earlier with a call to our load main menu function. And with that, we're ready to save the script with Control S and head back into Unity to set everything up. Okay, so now I'm back in Unity. So let's select our main menu button in the pause menu. And in the inspector, scroll down to the button component and add a new on-click event. Now we want to drag our GameManager into this variable slot here. And the function that we're going to choose for this button is on the GameManager script, and it is the load main menu function. Okay, so let's save the scene and try it out. Okay, so we're in game now. So let's just try hit escape, and I'm going to click on the main menu button. Excellent, you can see that's loaded me back into the main menu. So now if I click play, it will load me back into the game. So let's go and finish the level here. All right, so finish the level, and now I'm going to press any key. And that's loaded me back to the main menu because there was only one level available. Okay, so to demonstrate a bit better, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my level 1 scene in the project window, and I'm just going to duplicate it a couple times. So I'll duplicate it twice. So we have a level 1 and a level 1 2. And I'm just going to add them to the build settings. So I'll go File, Build Settings, and I'll drag them in. Now, this is just temporary. I am going to delete these later on. This is just to demonstrate that everything works. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start from the main menu here. So let's hit play again. Okay, so now if I hit play, it goes to the first level. And if we finish the level and then press a button, it loads the next level. We could pick up some score. Now the score won't transition between levels too. No, the pause still works on this second level as well. Let's hit the trigger. All right, so this should be the last level now. So when I hit this trigger and press a button, it'll take me back to the main menu. So there you go. That's a way of implementing a simple main menu, a pause menu and pause state for the game, as well as implementing incrementing levels. If you enjoyed the video and found it useful, please leave a like. If you want to see more game development tutorials and content like this, don't be afraid to subscribe. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a great day.